On September 12, 1899, Cornelius Vanderbilt II died in his bedroom at the Breakers. He was 55 years old, partially paralyzed from a stroke 3 years earlier, unable to speak clearly, unable to walk without assistance, unable to work, the only thing that had ever given his life meaning. The room where he died overlooked the Atlantic Ocean from a cliff in Newport, Rhode Island. 70 feet of windows, Italian marble, hand-carved limestone. One of 70 rooms in a house that cost $7 million to build. In today's terms, roughly $220 million. The grandest summer cottage ever constructed in America. 70,000 square feet, designed by architect Richard Morris Hunt, decorated by the best European craftsmen money could buy, fireproof construction, steel beams, brick, stone, marble, no expense spared. Cornelius had lived there for exactly 4 summer seasons. 4, that's all. The palace took 2 years to build, from 1893 to 1895. Cornelius moved in during summer 1895. He suffered a massive stroke in 1896, leaving him partially paralyzed. He lingered 3 more years, mostly bedridden, before dying in 1899. 4 summers, out of a 55-year life. That's what $7 million bought him. His friends said they never saw Cornelius smile, that he lived only for work, that even on vacation in Newport, where America's wealthiest families gathered to escape New York's summer heat, Cornelius brought ledgers and correspondence. He sat in his office at the Breakers, reviewing railroad reports while other men played tennis and sailed. The Breakers was supposed to prove he'd succeeded, that he'd inherited his grandfather's railroad empire and expanded it, that the Vanderbilt name still meant power and wealth, that he deserved to be called the head of America's richest family. Instead, it proved that building monuments doesn't make you happy, that 70,000 square feet of Italian Renaissance architecture can't cure joylessness, that you can own the grandest house in America and still die young, paralyzed, unable to enjoy any of it. The Breakers stands today as one of Newport's most visited attractions. Over 400,000 people tour it annually. They walk through the Great Hall. They admire the gold leaf and crystal chandeliers. They photograph the dining room's marble columns and painted ceiling. They see beauty, craftsmanship, Gilded Age excess. What they don't see, the man who built it worked himself to death before he could enjoy it. The widow who lived there alone for 35 years. The children who died young, typhoid, the Lusitania, alcoholism. The family that considered the palace a burden, not a blessing. The final Vanderbilt descendants evicted in 2018 after 125 years. The question isn't why the Breakers exists. The question is what it cost the people who lived there. If you enjoy explorations of grand historical properties and the complex stories behind them, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which property you'd like me to explore next. Your support makes these deep dives possible, and I read every comment. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin with a man born into America's wealthiest family who never learned how to stop working long enough to live. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was born on November 27, 1843, in Staten Island, New York. His grandfather, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, was already building the fortune that would make the family name synonymous with wealth. Steamships first, then railroads. By the time the Commodore died in 1877, he was worth approximately $100 million. In today's terms, roughly $3 billion. The Commodore didn't believe in dividing wealth equally among children. He left 95% of his fortune to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt, Cornelius II's father. The message was clear: keep the money concentrated, don't dilute the empire. William inherited in 1877. By the time he died in 1885, he doubled the fortune to $200 million. The richest man in America, the richest private citizen in the world at that time. Cornelius II was William's eldest son, the heir, the one expected to carry forward the Vanderbilt name and fortune. He was 42 when his father died, already deeply involved in managing the family's railroad interests. The New York Central Railroad, the Michigan Central, the Lakeshore, and Michigan Southern. Massive operations employing thousands, moving millions of tons of freight and passengers annually. Cornelius didn't inherit everything. William divided the fortune more equally than the Commodore had. But Cornelius received the largest share, approximately $70 million plus control of the railroad empire. He was now responsible for maintaining what his grandfather had built and his father had doubled. That responsibility consumed him. Friends and family described Cornelius as serious, dutiful, joyless. He worked constantly, reviewed every detail of railroad operations, attended board meetings, studied financial reports, negotiated with competitors and regulators. He had no hobbies, no interests outside business. When pressed to take vacations, he brought work with him. In 1867, at age 23, he'd married Alice Claypool Gwynn. She came from a respectable family. Her father was a lawyer and politician. The marriage produced 7 children: William, Cornelius III, called Neely, Gertrude, Alice, Gladys, Reginald, and Alfred. Alice was social, cultured, interested in art and music and the society life that wealthy New Yorkers pursued. Cornelius tolerated it. He funded her interests, he appeared at necessary social functions, but his heart was in the railroads. By the 1880s, the Vanderbilts had established themselves as leaders of New York society. They built mansions on Fifth Avenue. They summered in Newport, Rhode Island, where America's wealthiest families gathered. Newport wasn't a city, it was a stage, a place where Gilded Age millionaires built summer cottages, massive estates used only 3 months per year, to demonstrate their wealth and compete for social supremacy. The Vanderbilts already had a Newport cottage, the original Breakers, built in the 1870s by tobacco and banking heir Pierre Lorillard IV, and purchased by Cornelius II in 1885. It was large, 35 rooms, comfortable, appropriate for a family of Vanderbilt's stature. But in November 1892, it burned down. The fire started around 7 a.m. on November 25, 1892. Cornelius and Alice weren't there. They were in New York for the winter. The house was closed for the season, with only a skeleton staff maintaining it. One of the workers noticed smoke. By the time fire crews arrived, the wooden structure was fully involved. Newport's fire department fought the blaze for hours, but wooden Victorian mansions burned fast and hot. By late afternoon, the original Breakers was destroyed. Only the stone foundation and some exterior walls remained. The cause was never definitively determined. Possibly a defective flue, possibly an overheated chimney, possibly carelessness with the heating system. What mattered to Cornelius wasn't the cause, it was the response. Within weeks, he'd hired Richard Morris Hunt, America's premier architect. Hunt had designed the Vanderbilt family's Fifth Avenue mansions. He designed other Newport cottages. He understood both the Vanderbilt aesthetic and the competitive pressures of Newport society. Cornelius gave Hunt 2 primary directives. First, make it fireproof. Use steel, stone, brick, marble. No exposed wood if it could be avoided. The new Breakers would not burn. Second, make it the grandest cottage in Newport. Not just large, not just expensive, the grandest. The one that would make every other family's summer home look modest by comparison. Hunt designed a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo, modeled after 16th century Genoese palaces. Limestone facade, red tile roof, symmetrical design, every detail calibrated for grandeur. Construction began in 1893. The project would take 2 years and employ hundreds of workers. The cost estimates started at $3 million. They would eventually exceed $7 million. In 2024 terms, roughly $220 million. for a house used 3 months per year. The numbers clarify what words sometimes obscure. The Breakers sits on 13 acres overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The main house, 70,000 square feet across 4 floors plus basement, 70 rooms total. The Great Hall, 50 feet high, 45 feet long, walls covered in limestone carved by European craftsmen, a massive fireplace at one end, paintings and tapestries throughout, designed to impress visitors the moment they entered. The music room, gold leaf covering the ceiling and walls, crystal chandeliers imported from Baccarat, a grand piano, seating for musical performances and social gatherings, the room where Alice hosted Newport society. The dining room, seated 34 guests comfortably, marble columns supporting a barrel-vaulted ceiling painted with Renaissance-style scenes, a table so large it required a custom-built mechanism to raise and lower it to the kitchen below for serving. The morning room, Alice's private sitting room, platinum leaf on the ceiling, not gold, platinum, rarer, more expensive, more exclusive. The library, carved oak paneling, thousands of books, most purchased by the yard for decorative purposes rather than reading. Cornelius's office space when he worked at the Breakers. The bedrooms upstairs, each a suite with sitting room, sleeping chamber, and private bathroom. Marble bathtubs, running hot and cold water, still a luxury in the 1890s. Separate servants' stairs and corridors ensuring staff moved invisibly through the house. The basement, kitchens, laundry, storage, servants' dining hall, wine cellars. A complete service infrastructure hidden beneath the public rooms. Construction details, steel frame, revolutionary for residential architecture in the 1890s, brick walls, limestone facade shipped from Italy, marble imported from Italy and Africa, craftsmen brought from Europe to carve decorative elements on site. The grounds, 13 acres of lawns, gardens, walking paths, a children's cottage for the Vanderbilt children to play in, itself larger than most Americans' homes, iron gates at the entrance, stone walls surrounding the property. Operating costs. Difficult to determine precisely, but later estimates from the 1920s suggest approximately $83,000 annually. In today's terms, roughly $1.3 million per year, just to maintain a house used 3 months annually. Annual property taxes, thousands of dollars, increasing over time as Newport reassessed values. Staff required, approximately 30 full-time servants, cooks, maids, footmen, gardeners, laundresses, maintenance workers, all housed either in the mansion's servants' quarters or in separate buildings on the property. Total construction time, 2 years, 1893 to 1895. Hundreds of workers, around-the-clock shifts during peak construction, rush orders for materials from Europe. Final cost, $7 million, more than double the original estimate, roughly $220 million in 2024 terms. All of this for a summer house, a place the family would occupy June through August. 9 months of the year, the Breakers sat empty except for maintenance staff. This wasn't a home. This was a statement. Proof that the Vanderbilt fortune remained intact, that Cornelius II had succeeded as head of the family, that no other Newport family could compete. The problem was that statements don't make you happy, and Cornelius wasn't happy. During construction, Cornelius continued his grueling work schedule. He maintained offices in New York managing the railroad empire. He attended board meetings. He reviewed operational reports. He negotiated labor disputes. He dealt with competitors, regulators, investors, all the machinery of running one of America's largest business enterprises. The work never stopped, even when doctors told him to rest, even when friends suggested he was overworking, even when Alice pleaded with him to slow down. Cornelius couldn't stop. Whether because he felt the weight of family obligation, he was entrusted with preserving what his grandfather and father had built, or because work was the only thing that gave his life structure and meaning. Newport was supposed to be respite, 3 months away from New York's summer heat and business pressures, but Cornelius brought the business with him. Visitors to the Breakers during those early summers described Cornelius sitting in the library, surrounded by papers, barely acknowledging guests. Alice entertained, Cornelius worked. The children, William, Neely, Gertrude, Alice, Gladys, Reginald, and Alfred, grew up in luxury but with an absent father, present physically but absorbed in work, unable to engage, unable to relax, unable to enjoy the palace he'd built for them. In August 1996, 1 year after moving into the completed breakers, disaster struck. Cornelius's second son, Neely, Cornelius Vanderbilt III, announced his intention to marry Grace Wilson. Grace was from a wealthy family, but not Vanderbilt-level wealth. More importantly, Alice despised her, thought she was inappropriate, a social climber, unworthy of the Vanderbilt name. Alice forbade the marriage. Cornelius supported his wife. He told Neely the marriage would not happen, that if Neely defied them, there would be consequences. Neely was 23, in love, stubborn. He married Grace Wilson on August 1, 1996, in Newport without his parents' permission. The confrontation was explosive. Cornelius, already under enormous stress from work and the pressure of maintaining the family empire, suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke, during the argument. He collapsed, partially paralyzed on his left side, unable to speak clearly. At 52, the head of America's richest family was suddenly an invalid. He would live 3 more years, but he would never fully recover, never work again, never enjoy the breakers the way he'd imagined when he commissioned it. And he disinherited Neely, cut his son almost completely out of the will. The message: defiance has consequences. The stroke didn't kill Cornelius immediately, but it ended his life as he'd known it. He spent his remaining years at the breakers during summers and at the family's New York mansion during winters. Bedridden much of the time, requiring constant care, unable to manage the railroads, unable to work. Alice took over household management completely. She'd always run the social side of their lives, but now she managed everything: the properties, the staff, the children, the finances, with help from trusted advisors. Cornelius lingered. 3 years of partial paralysis, 3 years watching his empire continue without him, 3 years in the palace he'd built but could no longer enjoy. He died on September 12, 1899, at the breakers, 55 years old, a massive fortune, 7 children, the grandest summer cottage in America. And by all accounts, he died joyless. Friends said they'd never seen him truly happy, that work had consumed him, that even his palace, 70 rooms, $7 million, the envy of Newport, hadn't brought him peace. His funeral was held at St. Bartholomew's Church in New York. Thousands attended. The business world mourned the loss of one of its titans. The Vanderbilt family gathered to bury their patriarch. But the mourning was complicated because Cornelius's life had been complicated. Dutiful but joyless, successful but unfulfilled, wealthy beyond measure but unable to enjoy it. Alice became a widow at 53. She would live another 35 years. 35 years as Alice of the Breakers, perpetually dressed in black, perpetually mourning, perpetually maintaining the palace her husband had built and barely lived in. She never remarried, never left the breakers for long. It became her entire world, the place where she'd raised her children, buried her husband, and would spend the rest of her life preserving his memory. But the breakers, grand as it was, couldn't protect the family from tragedy. The palace walls were fireproof, but they couldn't prevent disease, disaster, or the slow dissolution of the Vanderbilt fortune. The tragedies came in waves. First was William, Cornelius and Alice's eldest son. He died in 1892 at age 21 from typhoid fever, before the breakers was even rebuilt, before Cornelius's stroke, before any of the later disasters. William was the heir, the one expected to carry on the family name and fortune. His death devastated Cornelius and Alice, though they rarely spoke of it publicly. Grief among Gilded Age aristocrats was private, controlled, hidden behind social propriety. Then came Neely's marriage and Cornelius's stroke in 1896, the disinheritance, the estrangement. Neely and Grace were essentially exiled from the family. They lived their own lives, had their own children, but the breach with Alice never fully healed. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, the youngest son, died in 1915 aboard the RMS Lusitania when it was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland. He was 37. Reports said he gave his life jacket to a woman passenger who didn't have one. He drowned when the ship sank. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, another son, drank himself to death. He died in 1925 at age 45 from cirrhosis. He'd burned through his inheritance, funding a lavish lifestyle, multiple marriages, and chronic alcoholism. Only Gertrude, Alice, and Gladys, the daughters, lived relatively long lives, but even they carried the weight of being Vanderbilts, the expectations, the scrutiny, the burden of maintaining appearances while the family fortune slowly evaporated. Because that was happening too. The fortune wasn't infinite. Cornelius II had inherited approximately $70 million in 1885. He'd managed it carefully, even growing it slightly. But the operating costs of properties like the Breakers, combined with dividing wealth among 7 children, minus Neely, meant each generation had less than the one before. By the 1920s and 1930s, the Vanderbilt fortune was still substantial, but no longer dominant. Other families had risen. The Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Mellons, fortunes built on oil and banking and industry rather than railroads. And the Breakers, magnificent as it was, had become a burden. Alice lived at the Breakers every summer from 1895 until her death in 1934. 39 summers, alone after 1899. The widow in black, the matriarch of a diminishing empire. She maintained the house meticulously, every room perfect, every chandelier polished, every garden manicured. The staff of 30 servants kept the palace running exactly as it had when Cornelius was alive. But the cost was staggering. By the 1920s, annual operating expenses exceeded $83,000. Property taxes increased as Newport reassessed values. Staff salaries rose. Maintenance on a 70,000-square-foot mansion never stopped. Alice had inherited enough to manage it during her lifetime, but she knew, everyone in the family knew, that the next generation might not be able to afford it. Her daughter Gladys inherited the Breakers when Alice died in 1934. Gladys was married to Count Laszlo Széchenyi, a Hungarian nobleman. They had children. They summered at the Breakers as Alice had. But Gladys saw the Breakers differently than her mother. Alice had viewed it as a sacred trust, a monument to her husband, a place that must be preserved exactly as Cornelius had built it. Gladys saw it as a liability, beautiful, yes, historically significant, certainly, but also crushingly expensive to maintain and impossible to justify in a post-Depression mid-20th century America that had moved past Gilded Age excess. The income from the Vanderbilt fortune wasn't enough to sustain it. Property taxes alone were thousands annually. Operating costs tens of thousands. And for what? A house used 3 months per year? Gladys considered options. Selling it, but who could afford to buy and maintain it? Converting it to a hotel or club, but that would desecrate her father's memory. Donating it to charity, but then the family would lose it entirely. In 1948, Gladys made a decision that Alice would have found unthinkable. She leased the Breakers to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 per year. The society would open it to public tours. Visitors would pay admission to walk through the Vanderbilt Palace. The revenue would cover maintenance and operating costs. The Breakers, built as the ultimate private statement of wealth and exclusivity, would become a museum. A tourist attraction, a place where ordinary people could gawk at how the rich had lived. Gladys retained the right to live on the 3rd floor during summers. The family could still use the property, but the grand rooms, the great hall, the music room, the dining room, would be opened to the public. It was pragmatic, necessary, the only way to preserve the building without bankrupting the family. But it was also an admission. The Gilded Age was over. The Vanderbilt fortune couldn't sustain the palaces it had built. The family that had once been America's richest was now dependent on tourist dollars to maintain their summer cottage. The public tours began in 1948, and the breakers became one of Newport's premier attractions. Visitors came by the thousands, then tens of thousands. By the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of thousands annually. They walked through rooms where Vanderbilts had entertained presidents and aristocrats. They photographed the gold leaf and marble. They imagined what it must have been like to live in such luxury. The Preservation Society reinvested tour revenue into maintaining and restoring the breakers. Slowly, carefully, they returned rooms to their 1890s appearance, located original furniture from auction records, repaired damaged plasterwork and gilding. The estate was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1971, designated a National Historic Landmark in 1994, official recognition of its architectural and historical significance. But here's what's strange. Even as the breakers became more famous as a museum, descendants of Cornelius and Alice Vanderbilt continued living there. Gladys and her husband Laszlo lived on the third floor every summer until their deaths, Gladys in 1965, Laszlo in 1968. Then their daughter, Countess Sylvia Sapari, took over the third-floor apartment. She lived there with her family every summer. In 1972, Countess Sylvia sold the breakers outright to the Preservation Society for $365,000, an absurdly low price even then, a fraction of the property's real value. But the sale came with conditions. Sylvia and her heirs retained the right to live on the third floor. So the Sapari family, direct descendants of Cornelius and Alice Vanderbilt, continued summering at the breakers. Tourists walked through the first and second floors below them. They lived upstairs in the family quarters, maintaining a connection to the palace their ancestor had built. This arrangement continued for decades, through the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. Countess Sylvia died in 1998, but her children, Gladys Sapari and Paul Sapari, maintained the summer residence tradition, until 2018. That year, the Preservation Society decided to terminate the arrangement. The third floor would be restored and opened to tours. The Saparis, the last Vanderbilts at the breakers, would have to leave. Paul Sapari, Cornelius II's great-great-grandson, was given notice. After 125 years of Vanderbilt family occupation, the breakers would become entirely a museum. Paul fought it, publicly. He gave interviews arguing that the family's presence gave the breakers authenticity, that visitors appreciated knowing descendants still lived there, that evicting them broke the spirit of the 1972 sale agreement. The Preservation Society countered that opening the third floor would enhance the visitor experience, that the family had occupied the space long enough, that times change and institutions must adapt. In the end, the Preservation Society won. Paul Sapari left the breakers. The third floor was restored and opened for tours. The last Vanderbilt was gone. Let's return to Cornelius, because his absence haunts everything that came after. He lived at the breakers for 4 summers, 1895, the year it was completed, 1896 before his stroke, 1897, 1898, 1899. 3 years as an invalid, partially paralyzed, unable to work or enjoy what he'd built. 4 summers out of a 70-room, $7 million palace. That's what his obsession with work bought him. Friends who knew Cornelius described him as incapable of relaxation. Even at Newport, supposedly a vacation, he brought railroad business. He reviewed reports. He dictated correspondence. He attended to details that could have waited. Why? What drove him to work so relentlessly that he destroyed his health and died at 55? Duty, perhaps. He'd inherited the responsibility of managing America's largest private fortune. His grandfather and father had built it. He was expected to preserve and grow it. That pressure, the weight of family legacy, consumed him. Or maybe it was identity. Cornelius didn't know who he was outside of work. His entire self-concept was tied to being a railroad executive, a business leader, the head of the Vanderbilt empire. Without work, he had no purpose. Or maybe it was simpler. He was unhappy, and work was the only thing that distracted him from that unhappiness. So he worked constantly, hoping that if he just achieved enough, built enough, succeeded enough,
The emptiness would fill. It didn't. The breakers didn't fill it. The fortune didn't fill it. The social status didn't fill it. He died joyless. That's what multiple sources say. Friends, family, biographers, they all describe a man who never seemed truly happy, who smiled rarely, who found no pleasure in the luxury surrounding him. The stroke in 1896 was probably inevitable. Years of stress and overwork and high blood pressure. The argument with Neely over the marriage was just the trigger. If it hadn't been that, it would have been something else. And after the stroke, Cornelius had 3 years to reflect. 3 years unable to work. 3 years in the palace he'd built. 3 years watching life continue without him. Did he regret it? Did he wish he'd worked less, lived more, enjoyed the wealth he'd inherited? We can't know. He left no introspective writings, no confessions, no late-life revelations about what mattered. What we do know is he died at 55, in the bedroom overlooking the Atlantic, in a house he'd commissioned to be the grandest in Newport, surrounded by luxury that brought him no joy. And Alice, left behind, spent the next 35 years in that same house, maintaining it, preserving it, living as a widow in a palace built by a man who'd worked himself to death.
There's a photograph of the Vanderbilt family at the Breakers, taken sometime in the mid-1890s. Cornelius sits in the center, formal, unsmiling. Alice beside him, elegant, composed. The children arranged around them: William, Neely, Gertrude, Alice, Gladys, Reginald, Alfred. Everyone dressed in the finest clothes, everyone posed perfectly. It looks like success, like a family at the peak of American society, the richest family in the country gathered at their summer palace. But look closer. Cornelius's expression isn't proud, it's stern, burdened, like a man carrying weight he can't put down. And within a few years of that photograph, tragedy would scatter them. William already dead from typhoid. Neely estranged after his forbidden marriage. Cornelius felled by stroke. Alfred eventually drowned on the Lusitania. Reginald drinking himself to death. The photograph captured a moment that looked like triumph, but was actually the beginning of long decline. Because the breakers couldn't protect them. 70 rooms and $7 million couldn't prevent disease or disaster or family conflict or the slow erosion of fortune and happiness. What the breakers could do, what it did do, was survive, outlast the people who built it, become a monument not to their success, but to the cost of that success. Cornelius built it to prove the Vanderbilt fortune was intact, to demonstrate that he'd succeeded as head of the family, to compete with the other Newport families and win. He won. The Breakers was and remains the grandest cottage in Newport. No other family built anything comparable. But the victory was hollow, because Cornelius barely lived to enjoy it, because the family couldn't afford to maintain it without opening it to tourists, because the last descendants were evicted in 2018. The Breakers survived. The family didn't. Not intact, not wealthy, not living the lives Cornelius had imagined when he commissioned the palace. Alice's 35 years as a widow at the Breakers deserve closer attention. She was 53 when Cornelius died in 1899. She would live until 1934, dying at age 88, more than half her adult life spent as a widow. She never remarried, never left the Breakers for extended periods. It became her identity, Alice of the Breakers, the Vanderbilt widow, the keeper of her husband's memory. Every summer she returned to Newport, opened the house, entertained society, maintained every tradition exactly as it had been when Cornelius was alive. She wore black for the rest of her life, full mourning attire, not just for a year or two, the customary period, but permanently, 35 years in black. What was she mourning? Her husband, obviously, but also what? The life they'd had? The life they might have had if Cornelius hadn't worked himself to death? The family that was fracturing despite her efforts to hold it together? Her children grew up and left,
married, had their own children, came to visit at the Breakers but lived their own lives elsewhere. Neely remained estranged. Alice never forgave him for the marriage that triggered Cornelius's stroke, never forgave Grace Wilson. They were excluded from family gatherings, written out of wills, treated as if they didn't exist. That estrangement was Alice's choice. Cornelius had disinherited Neely, but he died 3 years after the marriage. Alice had 35 more years to reconcile. She chose not to. Pride? Stubbornness? Genuine belief that Neely had betrayed the family? All three, probably, and the consequence was permanent division. A son exiled, grandchildren kept at distance, relationships destroyed over a marriage Alice disapproved of. The Breakers was Alice's fortress. She controlled it absolutely, decided who was welcome and who wasn't, maintained every detail according to her standards, used it as a tool to enforce family hierarchy and punish defiance. But fortresses are also prisons, and Alice spent 35 years trapped in a palace that reminded her daily of what she'd lost.
The operating costs of the Breakers reveal the impossibility of sustaining Gilded Age luxury into the 20th century. By the 1920s, annual expenses exceeded $83,000. In 2024 terms, roughly $1.3 million per year. For a house used 3 months annually. Break that down, roughly $27,000 per month. In today's terms, about $433,000 per month. For perspective, the average American household in the 1920s earned about $1,500 annually. The Breakers' monthly operating costs exceeded the annual income of 18 average families. What did those costs include? Staff salaries, approximately 30 full-time servants, cooks, maids, footmen, laundresses, gardeners, maintenance workers, drivers, each required salary, housing, and benefits. Utilities, heating a 70,000-square-foot mansion through Rhode Island winters, electricity for chandeliers and lighting throughout, water for fountains and bathrooms and kitchens. Maintenance, constant repairs to plasterwork, gilding, marble, woodwork, painting, roof maintenance, plumbing repairs. The house was massive and complex, something always needed fixing. Groundskeeping, 13 acres of lawns, gardens, trees, paths. Professional gardeners worked year-round to maintain the landscaping. Property taxes, thousands of dollars annually, increasing over time as Newport reassessed values. Insurance, insuring a $7 million property against fire, storm damage, theft, liability. And all of this just to keep the house functional, not to improve it, not to modernize it, just to maintain the status quo. The Vanderbilt fortune could sustain this during Cornelius's lifetime and through Alice's widowhood, but each generation inherited less, and the operating costs didn't decrease, they increased with inflation and rising wages. By the 1940s, when Gladys inherited the Breakers, the math no longer worked. She couldn't justify spending hundreds of thousands annually, in modern terms, to maintain a summer house she used 3 months per year. Opening it to tourists wasn't surrender, it was survival. The only way to keep the Breakers standing was to share it with the public and use admission fees to cover costs. The palace built to exclude became accessible only by including everyone. In 1994, the Breakers was designated a National Historic Landmark. Official recognition from the U.S. Department of the Interior, acknowledgement of the property's architectural and historical significance, permanent protection from demolition or inappropriate alteration. But here's the irony. The Breakers needed protection not from developers or vandals, but from the family that built it. If the Preservation Society hadn't taken control in 1948, if Gladys had tried to maintain it privately, the Breakers would likely have been sold, subdivided, or demolished by the 1960s or 1970s. The operating costs were unsustainable for private ownership. No individual or family could justify the expense. The property taxes alone would have forced a sale. And who would buy it? Who needed a 70-room summer cottage in the mid-20th century?
Post-war America had moved past Gilded Age excess. The age of servants and formal entertaining and seasonal migrations between multiple estates was over. The Breakers survived because it stopped being private, because it became a museum, because thousands of paying visitors generated enough revenue to cover maintenance and restoration. The family Cornelius had built it for couldn't afford to keep it, but the public he'd tried to exclude saved it. That's not just irony, it's historical justice. The fortune that built the Breakers came from railroads, infrastructure used by millions of ordinary Americans. Cornelius's grandfather and father had made their money moving people and freight across the country. And now, a century later, ordinary Americans paid admission to walk through the palace that fortune had built. They funded its preservation. They kept it standing when the Vanderbilt descendants couldn't. The Breakers became public property in everything but legal title. And eventually, in 1972, Gladys sold it outright to the Preservation Society for $365,000, a tiny fraction of its value, but enough to formalize what was already reality. The palace, built as the ultimate private statement, became a public monument, and thrived in that role in ways it never had as a private residence. The 2018 eviction of Paul Sapari, the last Vanderbilt at the Breakers, marked the end of an era. For 123 years, from 1895 to 2018, Cornelius Vanderbilt II's descendants had occupied the Breakers every summer. Through wars, depressions, social upheaval, technological change, the family presence had been continuous. Paul Sapari, Cornelius's great-great-grandson, had summered there his entire life. He'd grown up in the third-floor apartment, played in the gardens, walked the same halls his ancestors had walked. He gave interviews defending the family's right to stay, argued that their presence gave the Breakers authenticity, that visitors valued knowing descendants still lived there, that evicting them broke the spirit of agreements made decades earlier. The Preservation Society responded that times change, that the third floor, restored and open to tours, would enhance the visitor experience, that the Sapari family had occupied the space generously but not permanently. The dispute went public. Press coverage framed it as a David versus Goliath battle, a single family fighting an institution, Vanderbilt descendants versus preservationists. But really, it was about whether the Breakers was still a family home or purely a museum, whether descendants had inherent rights to occupy a space their ancestor had built, or whether public interest in preservation trumped private connection. The Preservation Society won. Paul Sapari left. The third floor was restored to its 1890s appearance and opened for tours. Visitors can now see the family quarters where Cornelius and Alice lived, the bedrooms, the sitting rooms, the private spaces that had been off-limits for 70 years while descendants occupied them. The restoration revealed original details, wallpaper, moldings, light fixtures. Historians studied photographs and records to recreate how the rooms looked when the family lived there. But something was lost, too, the living connection, the sense that the Breakers wasn't just a museum, but a home where descendants still gathered. Paul Sapari's eviction meant the Breakers became entirely historical, frozen in the 1890s, a monument to a family that no longer lived there and a way of life that no longer exists. Complete preservation, total disconnection.
Stand in the Breakers' Great Hall today, looking up at the 50-foot ceiling. The limestone walls, the massive fireplace, the paintings and tapestries, everything restored, pristine, exactly as it looked in the 1890s when Cornelius and Alice hosted Newport society. Now imagine, you're one of 400,000 annual visitors. You paid admission. You're walking through with a tour group, listening to a guide explain the architecture and history. You can look, but not touch. You can photograph, but not sit on the furniture. You can admire, but not inhabit. This is the Breakers now, a museum, a monument, a perfectly preserved artifact of Gilded Age excess. But try to feel what Cornelius felt standing here in 1895. What did this room mean to him? Pride, possibly. He'd commissioned the grandest cottage in Newport. He'd proven the Vanderbilt fortune could rival any European palazzo. He'd succeeded. But also burden, responsibility, the weight of knowing this room required constant maintenance, enormous staff, perpetual expense. And underneath, emptiness? Because Cornelius, by all accounts, didn't enjoy this, didn't find happiness in the marble and gilding, worked through every vacation, died young from stress-related stroke. The Great Hall was designed to impress visitors. It succeeded. It still succeeds. Everyone who walks through it feels awed by the scale and craftsmanship. But it couldn't impress Cornelius into happiness, couldn't give his life meaning beyond work, couldn't protect him from stroke or early death. The room survives. Cornelius doesn't. And the gap between what he built and what it gave him is the real story the Breakers tells.
The Vanderbilt fortune, once the largest private fortune in America, is essentially gone. Estimates vary, but by the 1970s, no single Vanderbilt descendant was extraordinarily wealthy by modern standards. Comfortable, yes, rich in comparison to average Americans, certainly, but nothing like the $100 to $200 million in 1877 to 1885 dollars the Commodore and William had accumulated. What happened? Where did it go? Division. Each generation split the inheritance among multiple children. The Commodore left 95% to William, keeping the fortune concentrated, but William divided more equally among his 8 children. Those children divided among their children, and so on. By the 5th generation, Cornelius II's great-great-grandchildren, each heir received a fraction of what their ancestors had controlled. Spending, operating costs for properties like the Breakers, Fifth Avenue mansions, yachts, art collections, servants. The Vanderbilts lived extravagantly, and that lifestyle consumed capital. Bad investments. Not every Vanderbilt was a savvy businessman. Some made poor choices, trusted the wrong advisors, lost money in failed ventures. Taxes, estate taxes and income taxes, introduced in the early 20th century, claimed significant portions of each generation's inheritance. The government reclaimed some of what the railroads had generated. Inflation and economic change. $1 in 1877 was worth far more than $1 in 1977, and the railroad industry that created the fortune declined as transportation shifted to cars, trucks, and planes. Lack of reinvestment. The later Vanderbilts didn't build new businesses or adapt to changing industries. They lived off inherited wealth without replenishing it. The result, by the late 20th century, the Vanderbilt fortune had dissipated. The name remained famous, but the wealth didn't. And the Breakers, the monument Cornelius built to prove the family's continued dominance, survived only because it stopped being private property. The fortune couldn't sustain the palace it built. The palace survived by becoming public. That reversal tells the entire story of Gilded Age wealth. What one generation builds, subsequent generations can't maintain. What seems permanent turns out to be temporary. What's designed to exclude ends up serving everyone.
Cornelius never smiled. That detail appears repeatedly in accounts of his life. Friends and family members all say the same thing. They never saw him truly happy. Never saw him laugh freely or relax completely. What kind of life is that? To have everything, wealth, property, status, family, and find no joy in any of it. Cornelius had 7 children. Did he play with them, read to them, enjoy watching them grow? Accounts suggest not. He was distant, formal, present physically but absorbed in work. The children grew up with nurses and governesses while their father reviewed railroad reports. He had a wife who loved him. Alice remained devoted even after his stroke, cared for him during his final years, mourned him for 35 years after his death. But did Cornelius love her back? Not with the passion of romance. Gilded Age marriages among the wealthy were often strategic alliances, but with companionship, partnership, mutual respect? The historical record is unclear. What's clear is that Alice spent more time mourning Cornelius than she'd spent living happily with him.
He had the Breakers, 70 rooms, 13 acres, ocean views, the grandest cottage in Newport. And he lived there 4 summers. 4, before stroke destroyed his health and death ended his life. What was it all for? What was the point of building a palace you barely inhabit, of accumulating wealth you can't enjoy, of working so relentlessly that you die at 55? Duty, maybe. Cornelius felt obligated to preserve what his grandfather and father had built. That obligation consumed him, left no room for pleasure or rest. Or maybe fear. Fear that if he stopped working, the fortune would collapse, that competitors would gain ground, that he'd fail the family legacy. Or maybe he just didn't know how to live any other way. Work was all he knew. It gave his life structure and purpose. Without it, he had no identity. Whatever the reason, the result was the same: a joyless life, a beautiful palace barely enjoyed, a fortune that couldn't buy happiness. And after he died, the palace became a museum, a place where strangers walk through and marvel at the luxury, while tour guides explain that the man who built it worked himself to death. That's the lesson the Breakers teaches. Not that wealth is bad, but that wealth without joy is tragedy.
The music room at the Breakers contains approximately $200,000 worth of gold leaf in $1895 dollars. The ceiling, the walls, the decorative moldings, all covered in gold beaten so thin you can see through it, then carefully applied by European craftsmen who trained for years in the technique. Why? What purpose did gold leaf serve beyond display? It caught light, reflected it, made the room glow during evening parties when hundreds of candles, later electric bulbs disguised as candles, were lit. It announced wealth. Only the richest families could afford gold leaf at that scale. Most Newport cottages used paint or less expensive finishes. It declared permanence. Gold doesn't tarnish like silver, doesn't fade like paint. It lasts centuries if properly maintained. So the Breakers' music room was designed to impress for generations, to show that the Vanderbilt fortune wasn't temporary, that their place in American society was secured. But here's what gold leaf couldn't do: make anyone happy. Alice hosted musical performances in that room, invited singers and musicians, entertained Newport society, and Cornelius sat through those performances dutiful but unsmiling, probably thinking about railroad business. The room was for Alice. She loved music. She loved entertaining. The music room was her domain, her joy. Cornelius funded it, built it, paid for the gold leaf and the chandeliers and the grand piano, but he didn't enjoy it. He participated because social obligation required it, not because it brought him pleasure. After his death, Alice continued hosting in the music room for 35 years. Performances and gatherings and social events, maintaining the traditions she and Cornelius had established. But it must have felt hollow, sitting in that gold-covered room, surrounded by luxury, alone, the partner who'd built it for her gone, the fortune that sustained it slowly diminishing, the children scattered to their own lives. Today, visitors photograph the music room obsessively. It's one of the Breakers' most stunning spaces. The gold leaf still glows, the craftsmanship still impresses. But the room is silent now. No music, no parties, just tourists moving through on guided tours, snapping pictures, then moving on to the next room. The gold leaf lasts, the life it was meant to contain doesn't. There's a moment during the tour when guides take visitors onto the back loggia, the covered porch overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The view is spectacular. 70 feet above the water, waves crashing on rocks below, endless blue horizons stretching to Europe. This was what Cornelius paid for, not just the house, but the location, the view, the prestige of being on Bellevue Avenue in Newport with an unobstructed ocean vista. Guides often tell visitors to imagine standing here in 1895. Imagine being Cornelius or Alice. Imagine hosting a party with hundreds of guests spilling onto this loggia, champagne in hand, orchestra playing inside. Imagine having everything. And then, guides usually mention, Cornelius barely enjoyed this. 4 summers before stroke and death. All this beauty,
all this luxury, and he worked through it. Some visitors find that sad. Others find it incomprehensible. Why build this if you won't enjoy it? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the building was the point, not the enjoying. Maybe for Cornelius, achievement was its own reward. Constructing something grand, proving he could do it, that was the goal. Actually living in it, actually relaxing and finding joy, that was secondary, or impossible, or never even considered. If that's true, then the Breakers wasn't a failure. It was exactly what Cornelius wanted, proof of success. Evidence that he'd managed the family fortune well enough to build the grandest cottage in Newport. The fact that it didn't make him happy doesn't mean it failed to serve its purpose. It just means its purpose was never happiness. That's the dark realization standing on that loggia, that you can have everything, ocean views, marble halls, gold leaf ceilings, and it still doesn't matter if you never let yourself feel it. The Atlantic crashes below, the same today as in 1895. The view hasn't changed, but the people who were supposed to enjoy it are gone, mostly having died young or sad or both. And the house remains, offering its view to strangers who paid $27 for admission. The Breakers stands today at 44 Ochre Point Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island. 13 acres overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, 70 rooms spread across 70,000 square feet. 400,000 visitors walk through its halls annually, paying admission to see how America's richest family once lived. It's been designated a National Historic Landmark, protected by federal law from demolition or inappropriate alteration, maintained by the Preservation Society of Newport County with meticulous attention to historical accuracy. The restoration is remarkable. Tour the house today and you're seeing it almost exactly as it looked in 1895, when Cornelius and Alice first moved in. The gold leaf in the music room still glows. The marble in the dining room still gleams. The carved limestone in the great hall still impresses everyone who enters. Preservationists have spent decades tracking down original furniture, locating pieces from auction records, commissioning exact reproductions when originals couldn't be found. They've studied photographs from the 1890s to ensure wallpapers and fabrics match the period. They've consulted with experts on Gilded Age interiors to get every detail right. The result is one of America's premier examples of Gilded Age architecture, a monument to excess and ambition, a palace frozen in time, preserved exactly as it was when Cornelius commissioned it to be the grandest cottage in Newport. And it is grand. Walk through it and you'll understand why visitors come from around the world. The scale alone is breathtaking. Rooms so large they dwarf human figures. Ceilings so high they create cathedral-like spaces. Details so intricate you could spend hours examining a single room. But the Breakers is also a tomb. Not literally, no one is buried there, but metaphorically. It's a tomb for dreams that didn't come true, for a vision of permanent wealth that dissolved within 3 generations, for a family that built something magnificent and then couldn't keep it. Cornelius wanted to build something permanent. He succeeded in that narrow goal. The Breakers will likely stand another century, maybe longer. As long as tourism revenue continues and the Preservation Society maintains it, the building will endure. Stone and steel and marble last. That was the whole point of the fireproof construction Cornelius demanded after the original Breakers burned. Build it so well, with such quality materials, that fire and time and weather can't destroy it. But he also wanted to prove the Vanderbilt fortune would endure, that the empire his grandfather and father had built would continue through his generation and beyond, that his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would live as he lived, in luxury, in power, at the center of American society. He failed at that completely. The fortune dissipated within 3 generations. By the time his great-grandchildren reached adulthood, there was no vast Vanderbilt wealth to inherit. The money had been divided and subdivided, spent on operating costs for unsustainable properties, lost to taxes and bad investments, and the simple mathematics of splitting inheritances among multiple children generation after generation. The last Vanderbilt descendants to live at the Breakers, Gladys and Paul Sapari, Cornelius's great-great-grandchildren, were evicted in 2018. After 125 years of continuous family occupation, the palace Cornelius built became entirely a museum.
The family connection, already tenuous, was severed completely. That eviction was symbolic. It marked the final end of the Vanderbilt era at the Breakers. No descendants would summer there anymore, no family gatherings in the Great Hall, no children playing on the lawns, just tourists and tour guides and carefully roped-off rooms that visitors could photograph but not inhabit. Cornelius also wanted to honor his family legacy, to show that he'd been a worthy steward of what the Commodore and William Henry Vanderbilt had built, to prove he deserved the responsibility of leading America's richest family. He partially succeeded at that. The Vanderbilt name remains famous today, more than a century after Cornelius's death. Everyone knows the name. It appears in history books, documentary films, museum exhibits, tours of Newport mansions. But it's famous now for the wrong reasons. Famous for excess, for mansions that families couldn't afford to keep, for a fortune built and lost within a century, for representing everything about the Gilded Age that modern Americans find simultaneously fascinating and repellent. The Vanderbilts are studied now as examples of how not to manage wealth, how not to raise children, how not to live if you want happiness alongside success. Their story is a cautionary tale about the limits of luxury and the dangers of joyless ambition. That's not the legacy Cornelius imagined. He imagined the Vanderbilt name meaning power, permanence, dynastic success stretching across generations. Instead, it means something closer to hubris and decline. But what did Cornelius actually want? What was he trying to achieve beyond the obvious goals of preserving wealth and maintaining status? We don't know, because Cornelius left no personal writings explaining his motivations, no diaries exploring his inner life, no letters revealing what he truly valued or hoped for or feared. We only have the evidence of his actions, a life spent working relentlessly until a stroke forced him to stop, a palace commissioned and built but barely inhabited, a fortune carefully managed and then divided among heirs who couldn't sustain it, a family that never fully recovered from the wounds he inflicted, disinheriting Neely over a marriage, working himself to death, leaving Alice to mourn alone for 35 years. Maybe Cornelius didn't know what he wanted beyond the next quarterly railroad report. Maybe work was all he had, all he understood, all that gave his life structure and meaning. And when the stroke took that away, he had nothing left. Just 3 years of lingering in a palace that must have felt like a monument to failure rather than success. The Breakers is beautiful, that's undeniable. Walk through it and you'll be genuinely awed by the craftsmanship, the scale, the sheer ambition of building something this grand for seasonal use. The marble columns in the dining room, each carved from a single piece of stone and imported from Italy. The gold leaf in the music room, applied by European craftsmen who trained for years in the delicate technique. The Great Hall's limestone walls, carved on-site by stonemasons brought from Europe specifically for this project. Every room contains details worth studying. The painted ceiling in the billiard room, the platinum leaf, rarer and more expensive than gold, on the morning room ceiling. The bathrooms with running hot and cold water and marble fixtures, luxuries that most American homes wouldn't have for decades. The restoration has preserved all of this. Visitors in 2024 see essentially what visitors in 1895 would have seen. That continuity is remarkable. It allows us to step back in time, to experience Gilded Age luxury almost exactly as it was. But beauty doesn't mean happiness. Luxury doesn't mean joy. 70 rooms filled with marble and gold don't fill the emptiness of a joyless life. Cornelius had everything the Breakers represents: wealth, property, status, a beautiful family, social position at the peak of American society. And by all accounts, he found no joy in any of it. He never smiled, friends said. He worked constantly, even on vacation in Newport, where other men relaxed and sailed and played tennis. He brought ledgers and correspondence to the Breakers and sat in the library reviewing railroad business while parties happened around him. He built this palace and then couldn't enjoy it. Lived there 4 summers before stroke destroyed his health and death ended his life at 55. 4 summers out of 70 rooms and $7 million. What was it all for? What was the point of accumulating wealth you can't enjoy, of building a monument you barely inhabit,
of working so relentlessly that your body fails before you're old enough to retire?
The answers that usually satisfy don't work here. Duty? Yes, Cornelius felt obligated to preserve the family fortune. But duty carried to the point of self-destruction isn't noble, it's tragic. Fear of failure? Possibly. Maybe Cornelius worried constantly that if he stopped working, the fortune would collapse, that competitors would gain ground, that he'd fail to live up to the legacy his grandfather and father had established. So he worked himself to death trying to prevent failure, and in doing so guaranteed the very thing he feared, his inability to continue, the transfer of responsibility to others, the eventual dissipation of the fortune. Or maybe he simply didn't know how to live any other way. Work was his identity. Remove work, and what remained? A man in a 70-room mansion with no idea what to do with himself or his wealth or his time? That might be the saddest possibility. Not that Cornelius couldn't enjoy the breakers, but that he didn't even know enjoyment was an option, that pleasure and relaxation and joy were foreign concepts to a man raised to view life as duty and obligation and endless work. If that's true, then the breakers wasn't a failure on its own terms. It accomplished exactly what Cornelius commissioned it to do: prove he'd succeeded, demonstrate that the Vanderbilt fortune remained intact, show Newport society that no other family could match Vanderbilt grandeur. The palace succeeded at all of that. It was and remains the grandest cottage in Newport. No other family built anything comparable. Cornelius won the competition he'd entered. The fact that winning didn't make him happy doesn't mean the palace failed. It means the competition itself was pointless, that building the grandest house is an empty achievement if it brings no joy, that you can win every visible battle and still lose the war against meaninglessness. Cornelius died at 55 in the bedroom overlooking the Atlantic, the ocean he'd paid millions to have an unobstructed view of, the waves he could watch from bed during his final paralyzed years. Did he find any peace in that view? Any consolation in having built something so grand? Any satisfaction in knowing the breakers would outlast him? Or did he die regretting the life he'd lived, wishing he'd worked less, enjoyed more, found some happiness in the wealth he'd inherited and the palace he'd built? We can't know. The historical record is silent on Cornelius's inner life during those final years. We only know he lingered, paralyzed and unable to speak clearly for 3 years after the stroke. 3 years in a palace he could no longer navigate, in a body that no longer obeyed him, with work, his only source of meaning, permanently out of reach. And Alice, left behind, spent the next 35 years in that same palace, in mourning, in black, alone except for servants and seasonal visitors and children who came but didn't stay. 35 years preserving a monument to a marriage and a life that had never been particularly happy. 35 years maintaining every room exactly as Cornelius had left it, as if preservation could resurrect meaning or justify the cost. The palace outlasted both of them, outlasted their children, William dead from typhoid, Alfred drowned on the Lusitania, Reginald drunk himself to death, outlasted their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, outlasted the fortune it built. The palace endures, the people are gone, and what remains is a museum where strangers walk through and marvel at the luxury, while tour guides explain that the man who built it worked himself to death and never learned to smile. That's the lesson the Breakers teaches if you're willing to look past the gold leaf and marble. Not that wealth is bad, wealth is neutral, a tool that can be used well or poorly, but that wealth without joy is just expensive tragedy. That you can have everything, ocean views, 70 rooms, Italian marble, European craftsmen, the grandest cottage in Newport, and it means nothing if you never let yourself feel it, never pause to enjoy it, never find meaning beyond the next business deal or quarterly report. The tours continue every day. 400,000 people annually walk through those marble halls. They photograph the gold ceilings and carved stone. They stand on the loggia admiring the Atlantic view. They imagine what it must have been like to live in such luxury. What they're seeing is what Cornelius built. What they're not seeing is what it cost him, what he never had, what 70 rooms and $7 million couldn't give him: happiness, peace, the ability to stop working and simply live. The house endures, perfectly preserved,
a monument to craftsmanship and ambition and Gilded Age excess. The people who built it and lived in it are gone, mostly having died young or sad or both, and the ocean crashes on the rocks below, exactly as it did in 1895, indifferent to palaces and fortunes and the human dramas that unfold and end while stone and water remain. The palace stands, empty of meaning except what visitors bring to it. Beautiful and tragic, a success and a failure, evidence of what wealth can build and what it cannot. And somewhere in those 70 rooms, if you believe in such things, maybe Cornelius still sits in the library reviewing railroad reports, unable to stop working even in death, forever trapped in the palace he built but never learned to inhabit, forever seeking satisfaction in achievement that brought him none. The chandeliers glow, the marble gleams, the tourists move through room after room, awed and photographing, and the breakers remains what it's always been, proof that you can have everything and still have nothing.